I'd like to take a moment to thank a few people who made this possible. First and foremost, very much appreciative and thank you to the veterans here today. Second, our host, Annette Goldman. Thank you. Let's give Annette a round of applause for Thank you for letting us use this venue and for bringing the sun out today. That was a blessing. Big thanks to John Merrill from Petaluma Community Access, Lindsay Hall, who was our bagpipist, the City of Petaluma, the Coast Guard, and the Argus Courier for making this happen. Now, if I could, I'd like to start by introducing our historian to talk a little bit about the Pacific War and what it meant to him. Marshall Davis.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, and good afternoon. I would like to take a few minutes to get us oriented on what life was like here at the beginning of this monster war. The war in Europe had started in 1939, but that was a long ways away from us here on the West Coast. However, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, came with a real bang to those of us here. Already there was military activity. Servicemen could see roaming the streets in off-duty hours all kinds of times. I'd like to walk you through those streets a bit. I was a kid living near downtown Oakland, 10 years old, on that Sunday, December 7th. I walked out of the movie theater to notice the police cars and military cars were driving around the streets with their loudspeakers blaring, "All servicemen report to their duty stations immediately." The newspapers came out with an extra edition, and the newspaper guys were soon pounding the streets with their papers saying, "Extra, extra, read all about it. Japs bombed Pearl Harbor." And we were on our way. The next day, Monday, was a school day, but it wasn't a normal one. In Oakland, I went over to my school. We were told the Japanese are bombing Los Angeles right now, and they're headed to the Bay Area next. You kids all go home. We're closing school. Go straight home. Some left in tears. In Oakland, the Oakland Tribune newspaper tower had a great big siren at the very top that could be heard all over town. And traditionally, it sounded off every day at noontime. Well, that was all over. That siren became our air raid siren. And one night after dark, after 9 o'clock sometime or other, that siren took off wailing loud and long. We had air raid wardens in the streets, and our apartment had a warden that herded us all down into the basement. We weren't there very long until when the street warden came in shouting, "Somebody left the light on upstairs, get it out." And the nighttime air raid warden, we were supposed to go into total blackout, no visible lights. Well, I was elected to run upstairs and turn out the light in the apartment house. So very fearfully, I took off, and I kind of knew the apartment well enough. I found the light, turned it off, got back down in the basement, and I felt like a real hero. The Japanese were master seamen, and they were masters at arming their sea vessels on down to the smallest, and I should say maybe even especially the smallest, their submarines. Within weeks of December 7th, the Japanese submarine surfaced near Santa Barbara and shelled petroleum facilities on the coast. Within months, another submarine surfaced up on the Oregon coast and shelled there. But most noteworthy was the fact that up the Oregon coast, an airplane had taken off from a Japanese submarine and bombed the Oregon coast. Now the Japanese had fully developed the capability of mounting a little bomb-capable seaplane in a submarine that was specially prepared. Our Navy had considered that and thought it was something that couldn't be done, but the Japanese had it perfected. Their little bomber flew back to his submarine, landed at sea, got tucked away, put away, they all got in, he submerged, and got away unharmed. Now our historians say a different thing. They said 2 B-25s were assigned to go out and find that sub, and they did find it in the report. They saw it surface in the distance, got up there, dropped all their bombs, saw an oil slick come up on the ocean, and reported it sunk. Well, many years later, an American author, he co-authored a book about the Japanese submarine ventures with Japanese submariners. And that captain of that very submarine was one of those interviewed and telling his story. He said, yes, we got our plane loaded back up, everybody on board, we soaked, we dived, got down there, I turned loose a bunch of oil to fool those American airmen, and we drove away, and he lived out the rest of the war. So that was the story of being bombed by a plane that could be managed from a submarine. The Army had one unit based in the Presidio, which was a big Army camp. It wasn't like a country club like it is now. But a unit there got organized and armed, and they patrolled the coastline by walking along the coast clear up into Oregon. Now, I didn't find out about this until many years after my service in the Korean War, when I was back in college, thankfully now on the GI Bill. And the commanding officer of the college ROTC unit there had participated in that mission and walked the coast from San Francisco up into Oregon. That was December 1941. Now, the Japanese were known to have a spy network around, and they were headquartered across the border into Mexico, where our authorities couldn't do much about them. Another thing was that a big part of the Japanese population here were first-generation immigrants from Japan. There was a sentiment that if the Japanese invaded the West Coast, they would quickly go to all of the Japanese here and tell them to fight against the Americans in honor of your emperor. Now, these were the factors that led to the internment of the Japanese during World War II. Much since thought of as a terrible thing. I recall seeing an Asian on a street in Oakland with a card hanging around his neck saying, "I'm Chinese, please." Asians had a hard time getting those things. The Bay Area became a real beehive of military activity. In fact, on our elementary school playground, we had a radar unit that scanned the skies for airplanes. Oakland Airport became Oakland Army Airfield, and I recall seeing out there watching the sky almost every airplane in our arsenal. Many flew out of Oakland or the Alameda Naval Air Station. Hamilton Field housed some of our fighter protection in the name of the good old B-40s. Also, at Hamilton Field, right down here in Nevada. And also, Hamilton Field had been the departure point for a group of B-17 bombers that flew into Pearl Harbor on that fateful December 7th morning. They confused the commanding officer of the lone soldier who called back that he sees a bunch of airplanes on his radar screen. And that captain says, "Oh, it's probably those planes coming in from California." A little bit later, the awesome Japanese Air Armada flew into town. The Alameda Naval Air Station became a huge operation. And already in April, the USS Hornet loaded Colonel Jimmy Doolittle 16 B-25s aboard, and they headed out to the Pacific and bombed Japan. Our bay was lined with all kinds of production, big shipbuilding and repair facilities. The Ford Assembly plant in Richmond converted over to turning out military vehicles and tanks. Richmond became the home of industrialist Henry Kaiser's massive shipyards. They got to where within a week, they could build a Liberty ship, which was a cargo and troop carrier type. Hunters Point, south of San Francisco, and Mare Island, near Vallejo, were massive repair operations for warships. Now, one way the war against Japan differed from that in Europe was simply the vastness of the Pacific theater of operations. Can you imagine from Hawaii to Australia to the Philippines to China, the Japanese coast, the Aleutian Islands? Our Navy was beyond its limits and capability. And every dry land soldier had a long boat ride to go before he got to where the action was to be. And much of that action was on beaches or in steamy jungles with malaria-infested mosquitoes and infecting fungus, an everyday part of life. Everywhere, for everyone, everywhere, the next stage of life was getting into the military and going to war. More than 16 million Americans served, nearly 300,000 paid with their lives, and more than twice that many were wounded. This is a reminder that our freedom is not free. We have here with us today some of that greatest generation who will now tell us the story of their war in the Pacific. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Marshall. If I could now, I'd like to invite a very special guest up. I'm sure you all know him. He's a local legend around Petaluma for the Argus Courier. He really makes it a point, and thank you so much for what you do. Harlan Osborne really takes the time and energy to document a lot of these local stories, and he's actually had the privilege of interviewing a few of these gentlemen here. Would you mind sharing a little bit of their background, Harlan? Okay.
Thank you. It's nice to see such a great turnout here today. Generally, I don't do much speaking. I'm better at listening, so you can bear with me with some of my jumping around here. First of all, I want to thank Joe for organizing this afternoon, and Ken and Annette Golterman for allowing us to come out here in these lovely gardens. This used to be a chicken ranch, you know, that Ken's dad had, started in 1937, and which Ken has made into these beautiful gardens. Most of you all also probably know that Skillman Lane here used to be full of chicken houses. Jim Larson, a salesman in Petaluma, once wrote in a book that Skillman Lane had more egg producers than any other road in the world at one time. So we're in a historical part of the country. I'm very fortunate in what I do because I get to meet a lot of old-timers and local legends and long-time families in Petaluma, which allows me to listen a lot. And I had the good fortune to meet 3 of these men that I've written about, and it's just so inspiring to be able to meet the people that I grew up around and be able to write a little bit about them. So I've just made some quick notes from what I wrote in my earlier columns. I'll share a little bit this with you. First, I wrote about Irv Giacomini over here. Irv and I have a lot in common. We both grew up on the east side of Petaluma, although at different times. I didn't know it until 50 years later, but the fields I used to play in as a kid belonged to his family. And then later, I also learned that I was he and his wife Loretta's paperboy with the Argus Courier. So it is a small town. We don't often talk about military things when I interview people, but Irv did tell me that during World War II, he fought in the South Pacific and made 5 D-Day landings from New Guinea to the Philippines. So I admire that. It was really fun to finally get to know him. Next is Bob Harriot. Bob doesn't know it, but I knew him for a long time before he ever knew me. I used to come out to the ranch with my friend who, Bob's daughter was my friend's girlfriend. So we came out very often, and also with his son Steve, we would come out and be there. He also owned the smoke shop in Petaluma. So, of course, smoke shops aren't what they are today, what they were back then. Bob told me he enlisted in the Army just after high school in '44, and he was serving in the Pacific. He was sent to the Philippines, and he later became a military policeman. And he actually guarded the Imperial Palace in Japan at one time. So he might want to share more of that with everybody. Over here is Clint Grove. Clint's not a native Petaluman. He didn't come here till 1942. Oh. But it's kind of fun, interesting how he did come to Petaluma. He was on leave he was over at Mare Island, and he was invited to come to dinner, which a lot of servicemen love to go to dinner or have a home-cooked meal. So he was invited to a lady named Maria Gambonini. And at Gambonini's, he met this nice young lady, Lorraine Bola, who would become his wife, future date. He told me at the time that she looked at him rather disapprovingly when they met. One of the ships he was on early, the Astoria, they were based in Pearl Harbor also, but they were out at sea. I think they were headed towards Midway, I'm not sure, but they were at sea. Wake Island he was headed for, and so they missed the bombing of Pearl Harbor, fortunately. It would have been in port. So following the Battle of Midway, he was ordered to, they were at Midway for the battle, and then when they came back, he was ordered to go to Mare Island again. The Astoria deployed without him and was later torpedoed in the Solomon Islands. So he missed that boat. Aboard the USS Denver, his ship was torpedoed and left drifting. He said how fortunate he was that the Japanese fleet decided to leave that area, and the Denver was later towed to port. While in the Navy, Clint was awarded 13 commendations and citations, among them the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 13 stars. He told me he fought in virtually every naval battle in the Pacific. One of the things I really remember was he told me he carved his initials in Borneo with a .50 caliber machine gun. He wrote home every day. He wrote it home to his wife every day, which sharpened his writing skills tremendously. And Clint wrote a book. It's called One Remained on Station, One Found Its Way Home. You Navy men probably know what that means. One that remained on station were the ones that were sunk. So Clint felt very fortunate that he spent his life in the Pacific. He said to me several times, he says, people don't realize how large a battlefield that actually was. Owen Fredericks was going to come today, and I was going to tell you a few things about Owen. Owen was in World War II, a trained fighter pilot. He flew Hellcats and Corsairs. But he was on a ship on the way to Japan when the war ended. So he came home, worked with his family. He owned Klein Furniture back in the 50s, or late 40s. He was a partner in it. Then when the Korean War started, he was called to active duty, where he flew 147 missions in Korea. His plane was shot up 4 times. He crash landed on a carrier deck. There's quite a bit of interesting things about Owen, but I'm not going to share them with you right now, but if you want to know more, you can read my column Thursday.
A teaser.
While I'm up here, I want to remind everybody that this year is the 75th anniversary of the Sonoma Marine Fair. And we're going to make a historical exhibit there. So if anybody knows people that exhibited early on, I know they would be pretty long in the tooth by now, but people that have ribbons, we would love to find old ribbons or some things to display. That would really be helpful. So you can contact me, or you can contact Catherine Reinhardt at the Sonoma County Library. And again, I'm honored to meet with these men. I'm honored to grow up in Petaluma. And it just keeps getting better and better. Thank you.
Thank you, Harlan. And to round out the group here that are also extremely noteworthy, Jack Krout, I'm going to let him just share a little bit. He's done just about everything, aviator extraordinaire. Jack, you want to just quickly mention your background?
Well, I'm not a native Petaluma. I only got here in '48 for the first time. Actually, I enlisted the 8th of December 1942, and at that time we weren't aware of it, but FDR and the people in government had looked at the Spanish Civil War, and they said, the next war is going to be fought along the same lines as the Spanish Civil War. Therefore, we're going to have some aviators. We're going to have an Air Corps. We need pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, radio operators. So they said, we'll test every man that is either enlisted or every man that is drafted, and any of them that test over 160 IQ, they will be automatically assigned to the air arm, either the Navy or the Army. I enlisted primarily because I'd been in the primitive area of Montana and Idaho, and I'd been dragging a mule string, among other things, and so a friend of mine was a main line packer up on the Deep Creek Ranger Station. He and I said, this was at the time when they announced it, every man, when he turned 18 and a half, was going to have to be signed up for the draft. He and I were of the same opinion. I was in the University of Montana as he was. And we both said, we are not going to register for any damn draft. We're not going to be drafted. We went down to the enlisting station and enlisted. We both wanted to go into the Army or into the Artillery Corps because we've been dragging mule strings in primitive area. We thought that'd be great. When I got to Butte, Montana, and was tested, they said, "Well, you're not going to the Artillery Corps. You're going to the Army Air Corps." And they took the other man. They said, "All right, you're going into the Artillery Corps," and he was killed on Saipan dragging a mule string. I got to Fort Douglas, Utah, got my uniform. They said, "All right, you new Air Corps people, get on board. You're going down to Wichita Falls, Texas, to Shepherd Field." And there they said, after we finished basic, we stood on the railroad tracks all day in a rainstorm. And every other group got aboard a train and shipped out all over the country. They came to us, they said, "Well, it's chow time. You fall out and go to the dining hall or the mess hall and get back here at such and such a time." We got back there, fell into formation. They marched us around the corner and said, "Fall out, you're going to be glider mechanics, and there's where you're living. So I started my life as a glider mechanic on CG-4A gliders. Since I assembled the first glider that flew out of Alliance, Nebraska, the pilot said, since you put it together, you're going to fly in the right seat. That's fine. I had flown with him one other time in a light airplane in L2, and he hadn't checked the gas tank. We were airborne about 30 minutes, and he said, I think we better return to base. I don't have any fuel. And about that time, the engine quit, and we landed in a pasture. And I had to hike over the fence and back to Alliance Army Airfield to get a 5-gallon jerry can full of gas and come out to get out of the farmer's pasture. He was the same one who was going to be the test pilot for the CG-4A. We lined up, we had a crosswind, but we lined up behind the C-53, pulled 100 yards of nylon cord about an inch thick with 10-pound weights on each end, connected it, and the airplane started up, and we lifted off before the tail came up on the 53. We drifted off to the side. The co-pilot aboard pulled the salvo disc, and that 10-pound weight came back between the pilot and myself through the plexiglass nose. We're down in the boondocks, and I rush over, get my CG or my tractor, and pull the damn thing in, and got out my pinking shears and glue pot, made some repairs to the plexiglass, and a couple hours later we were out on the runway again. The airplane pilot came up to us, and he grabbed the flight officer by the shirt collar and tie, said, "Damn it, you stay right behind me, don't you drift to either side." "Yes, sir." And he turned, the pilot turned to me and he said, "You don't have anything to do until we come in. I'll ask for spoilers, and you give me spoilers." "Yes, sir." And we took off. It was noisy, it was rough, miserable flying in a glider behind a 2-engine aircraft. We got to 5,000 feet. We pulled the plug and cut loose from the airplane. It was peaceful and quiet. It was flying like aviation was meant to be. And we came in on the final approach. He says, "Give me spoilers," and I gave him spoilers, and we came down like a damn elevator. We landed a quarter mile short of the runway in a farmer's cornfield. And the corn is coming up through the front of the glider. And I rushed back over and got the clee track and came and drug it back. And I said, if that is what flying is all about, I'm going to be in that seat and not in the right seat. So I went down to the orderly room and applied for aviation cadets, and they sent me off to aviation cadets. I had graduated, twin-engine pilot, thought I'd go out to P-38s. "No, you're going to be a co-pilot aboard B-24s." So I ended up in Florida with a B-24 co-pilot training at Buckingham Field. And we thought, well, we'll get a new plane and we'll get a new crew here and we'll fly across to Africa. Well, that wasn't to be. They put us aboard a train and sent us out to the Navy base down in Southern California. And you'll get a crew assigned there. We picked up our crew, put us aboard another little train, took us to Tonopah, Nevada. There we did our phase training. We made crew of the week several times. And the day that President Roosevelt died, the 12th of April, they said, all right, crew 327, you can go on furlough for 15 days, be back here for reassignment, you're going to the Pacific. I went home to Montana, and the prettiest girl I had ever seen was still in school there. When I first met her, we'd just painted the M on the side of Mount Sentinel. Came down and the women were supposed to set up a luncheon for us. And there she was behind that lunch counter, putting mustard on her hot dog. I held mine out to have her put mustard on it, and she flat ignored it. I went through the line, got a cup of lemonade, and in those days we had to chip the ice off of a block of ice. And walked around, I saw her sitting on a rock. I walked around behind and dropped a few ice cubes down, or flakes of ice down the back of her neck. I did get her attention. A few years later, when I'd finished phase training, I went home on this furlough, and since I had grown up in a tent in the Bitterroot Valley, I wasn't too keen on seeing my parents, especially my mother. So I stopped by her home in Helena, Montana. And during the course of a few days, we walked to the family cabin, which was 5 miles from the doorstep of the capital of Montana. Snow on the ground, big berm of snow around the cabin, and there was one little spot of grass. We sat down there and talked a little bit, and I asked her if she'd marry me, and darned if she did. We were married, and of all places to take a new bride, I took Verna to Tonopah, Nevada. She tells the story that when we walked back to town, she said, "You've got to ask my father." So I went in the house, and he'd already gone to bed. I told him to ask his wife if I could see Otto, and she said, "Well, he's in his pajamas," but he got up and he came out, and I asked if I could have her hand. And he agreed, and that was 69 years ago. We've had a great time. We came to Petaluma from Japan, where I had ended up on the invasion fleet. Going into Japan, thank God Uncle Harry dropped the bomb and stopped that massacre. I had been sent overseas as a twin-engine fighter pilot, and I'd never been in the cockpit of a twin-engine fighter. But when we got into Itazuki, Japan, Lefty Parker, the commander, said, "Jack, everybody wants to fly the P-61. I can't let them all go down there, but I'm going to assign you to the 421st Night Fighter Squadron, and you can fly the P-61. So I'm very happy to be able to fly the P-61. It had 4 20-millimeter cannons in the belly and 4 50s in a turret right over your head. And if you don't think that made some racket when you're doing gunnery. When we came back to the States, I'd had enough standing alert. I wasn't about to volunteer for any fighter squadron that was on the West Coast that was going to have me stand alert. And sure enough, I get my assignment, Hamilton Field, the first of 5 tours. I get there, and here's Lefty Parker. He's the DO, or Deputy for Operations. In the course of many of those assignments, I worked for Lefty. And one day he sent his secretary down and said, "Jack, the general wants to see you." I went upstairs and he said, "Jack, Janet and I are having a party for the staff. We'd like you and Verna to be the host and hostess for the party so that we can enjoy it and have a drink." That was fine. We did this on a number of occasions. And one night after everybody had gone home, we were sitting around his fireplace with him and his wife. And he said, "Jack, whatever happened to Joe in Montana, or Joe Humble in Montana?" I said, "Hell, General, he's dragging a mule string west of Hamilton out in the primitive area." "How the hell do you know Joe Humble?" "Oh, he was dragging a mule string up the Westport when I worked for your dad in 27. So I found out how I was snake bit and had 5 tours of Hamilton Air Force Base.
Well, Roman, did you want to say anything about your son?
I could. Do you mind if I stay seated?
No.
I'm wearing a brace and it's difficult. I'm not a native Petaluma. I moved to Petaluma by choice. I was born in Brooklyn, one of those famous Brooklyn boys. December 7th, 1941, as you know, Pearl Harbor was born. I was too young to join. However, in 1942, a few months after Pearl Harbor, I turned 18 and immediately joined the Navy. I was sent to boot camp, and in boot camp, when given my choice, I asked to go into the medical corps. It was my hopes all my life to become a doctor, and I figured that would be the way to go. I spent most of my time in Portsmouth, Virginia, Portsmouth Naval Hospital, which was built prior to the Civil War. I became a pharmacist mate second class. I became a lab technician. I became a specialist in something I'd rather not discuss or tell people about. I haven't spoken to my wife about it in all of these years. In 1944, I received orders, proceed to the West Coast, destination unknown. We ended up at the Tanforan racetrack south of San Francisco. On December 7th, 1944, I became part of Fleet Hospital 115. And our duties was overseas duties, destination unknown. 10 days later, we boarded ship, headed out to the unknown. By the way, heading towards Pearl Harbor, we were attacked by a submarine. And of course, the destroyers and threw their ash cans and all. And the next day, Tokyo Rose came up and said we were all sunk and named every ship in the convoy. We laughed about it, but luckily it was just a lot of propaganda. We got to Guam in January 1945. We were commissioned to build a 1,500-bed hospital. And we were supposed to have the hospital completed by July. However, we had the CBs there. They showed us how to build. They supervised us. We built the hospital and completed it by April, month ahead of schedule. From there on, we took care of the survivors of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. By the end of the war, we had taken care of roughly 10,000 survivors of those two conflicts. The war was over towards the middle of 1945. Of course, people started to go home and the rest of it. But there are stories in World War II. There are stories I heard that are fabrications. There are stories I've read where the details have been befuddled. But most important, there are stories in wartime that are never written down. There are reasons for it. And there's one in particular that I'm very proud of. Let's go back to the day when Truman ordered the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. It was dropped on Hiroshima, and General Tojo, who was the Prime Minister of Japan at that time, told the people that this was just an aberration, there's no such thing as a bomb like that, etc., etc. We, on the other hand, were talking to Tokyo via the Swiss embassy. And the Swiss embassy passed on the word to them that if they didn't surrender, we were going to drop a second bomb. They didn't surrender. We dropped a second bomb, as you know, in Nagasaki. At that time, Tojo didn't do anything. It was the Emperor Hirohito himself who went ahead and said he's willing to surrender. This is the part that you've never heard of. General MacArthur told him, no, we won't accept your surrender unless. I'll keep the unless for a little later. Why did he refuse the surrender? Have many of you seen that motion picture called The Big Raid? Where this group raided a prisoner of war camp in the Philippines and got out 500 prisoners safely and all. Do you remember that? A movie was made of it and the rest of it. It was true. We knew that the Japanese mistreated prisoners of war, killed them. Most of these fellows can attest to that. They didn't want the world to know what they did with prisoners of war. There was one camp in the Philippines when they were being beaten and wanted to leave it. They locked everybody in the barracks, poured gasoline on the barracks and set it on fire. This was their plan, as you know in that motion picture, The Big Raid. They were getting ready to do it again. That's why they raided it. We knew what they did with the prisoners of war. That was the reason that MacArthur said, no. We will not accept your surrender unless you give us back every slave and prisoner of war that you have in Japan. And the emperor said, yes. We took every seagoing vessel that we could find. We outfitted it with beds and all. We picked personnel that we needed surgical personnel, dental personnel, every type of personnel, we have to outfit it. Actually, when they came to the laboratory, we drew cards. Oh, Bill was lucky enough to be one of the first to go to Japan. However, I had a very good friend, Carmel Petrie Jr., he was from West Virginia. Very good friend. Billy says, I'll give you anything you want, anything. I want to be the one to go. I want to be the one to go. I wasn't going to be stupid enough to go to a place that they might even know the war was over. So I says, Carmel, go ahead. In any event, the trip took roughly 10 days. They went to Japan. All of these ships loaded up as many passengers, as many prisoners as they can carry, and came back to Guam. Guam was always a U.S. possession, so we had hospitals there. And we had fleet hospitals and army hospitals and all of the different hospitals. And we got all of these prisoners. In our hospital, we got these civilian prisoners. Women, young children. Have you ever seen a skeleton with skin and nothing else? That's what Japan did to their prisoners. To this day, the memories of it just eat you up. To see hundreds of people walking skeletons, barely alive. But we got them. MacArthur said, no, we got our prisoners back. We went ahead and fed them, got them well enough to send them back home. And the war was over for all of us. I got home at the end of March 1946. I served from 1942 through 1946. And I said goodbye. I want nothing to do with it ever again. I'm happy here in Petaluma. I love everything about it and the people here. But I'm glad I was one of those guys that tried to save them, not kill them.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. At this point, I'd like to introduce City Council Member Mike Harris to read the proclamation.
Well, it's my honor to be here today on behalf of the City of Petaluma to present this proclamation for the War in the Pacific Remembrance Day. And first off, I did want to take a moment and thank Mr. Norriel for putting all of this together. I've had the honor of the last few months to go to a few of his things that he's put together. I remember meeting Don Hanahan from one of the last surviving members of the Manhattan Project. Of course, Rex Walheim, one of the last astronauts on the space shuttle. And it's an amazing job that he's doing, bringing this living history to Petaluma to allow us to hear the stories from these individuals. And of course, hearing via Harlan from the people that he talked to. I look forward to seeing your article on column on Thursday. And of course, hearing it right from the gentleman, Mr. Jack Krout, and of course, Bill Brotman here. So it's my honor, and thank you, Joe, for putting this all together. So without further ado, I will read the proclamation, present the proclamation to these individuals. Whereas, beginning at Pearl Harbor with the day of infamy that saw the sinking of the USS Arizona and ending on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, many of the key battles of World War II were waged on and near American shores and throughout the Pacific. We must always remember the debt we owe to the members of the greatest generation for our liberty, as their gift is an enduring peace that transformed enemies into steadfast allies in the cause of democracy and freedom around the globe. And whereas Americans will never forget the harrowing sacrifices made in the Pacific by soldiers and civilians that begun at dawn on December 7, 1941, at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. The surprise attack killed more than 2,000 American military personnel and dozens of civilians and thrust the United States fully into World War II. And whereas America responded and mobilized our forces to fight side by side with our allies in Europe, Atlantic, and the Pacific theaters, the United States Navy engaged in epic sea battles such as at Midway, and our air forces fought extraordinary land battles for the possessed of occupied islands. These battles led to significant loss of life for both sides, as well as for the island's native peoples. Battlegrounds such as Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa are remembered for the heroic sacrifices and valor displayed there. And whereas all citizens are beholden to these World War II veterans who risked life and limb to preserve the liberties and freedoms we take for granted, and therefore we recognize this special day to honor the services of these gentlemen, and we have one for each gentleman, for Mr. Irv Giacomini, Mr. Bob Harriot, Clint Grove, Owen Fredericks, who can't be here, but I heard his son is here as well, Mr. Jack Krout, and of course Mr. Bill Brotman. Now therefore be resolved that Mayor David Glass, along with the members of the Petaluma City Council, do hereby proclaim today, Saturday, March 1st, 2014, as War in the Pacific Remembrance Day in the city of Petaluma, and your service will never be forgotten. So thank you very much.
Does anybody else want to say anything?
Could I say just a few
Yes,
words?
please.
I want to thank everybody that's here. I was in the service. I went in 1942. I went into the Pacific. I trained up in Bend, Oregon in December. And in August, I left Oakland, going underneath the San Francisco Bridge, Golden Gate. We all looked at that bridge, and I said to one of the fellows, I wonder if we would see this again. And the guys all looked and says, I wonder too. Well, the worst part, I'm going to make it short. We made a couple of landings. I went to 3 different islands on New Guinea, and then the worst island we went on was the Philippines. In the Philippines, we made the invasion, and we had a young kid, just got there about a week or two before we left, and he got a letter from his wife, and had the little baby about 6-7 months old, and said, look at this nice baby, I hope I get to see it. We all said, yes, you're going to see it. And by God, when we went to make the invasion of Leyte, all these craft was coming up, and there was about 14, 15 gets on these landing crafts. And so he was going down, and I was going to go down, and the coxsman down there said, that's enough. So he went down, I shook his hand, I said, well, I'll see you over on the island. He said, okay. So we all got down. Another buddy of mine was in the back. Of course, we're all buddies. Says, well, we got to watch that landing. Anyway, a Japanese mortar shell came right over, and that ship we were watching was about from here over to those houses, and it came right down directly onto the ship and blew the ship up. And we said, oh my God. So that was it. So we landed on there, and we went in about 3 or 4 o'clock. We came back, and who came on the island was General MacArthur and his wife and 4 or 5 guards, I guess. Of course, I was only, at that time, maybe 19 years old. I said to my sergeant, I'm going to go over and shake his hands. And the sergeant says, if you go over there, you might not come back, neither. I said, really? He says, yeah, because that's General MacArthur. And I said, okay, so I didn't go over. Anyway, making it short, we had a lot of our soldiers were wounded and real bad, and we put them on the Red Cross ship. We had the Red Cross ship come in about that next day, And they didn't have any place, so we put them on there and we said, hey, you're going to be saved. About 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a Japanese plane came over and crashed right into the smokestack and blew them all up. If you don't think that was bad, I tell you, it was something else. Another plane came and hit into our other ship, another ship, which was one of the big ships, and we had soldiers was out in the water, jumped out, and they were swimming around there, and I was looking, this was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I guess. I don't remember the time, but it was there. I kept looking out there and said, what could we do with them poor guys? And one of the soldiers grabbed me and says, come on, we can't do anything about it. But you know, it's really sad to see all of this, and I try to forget about it, but a lot of times it comes to my head. Another time on Mindoro, we went to Mindoro, and we made the invasion of Mindoro, and the next day a big oil tanker came in, loaded with oil. And we all seen him and said, whoa, look at that big ship. And he says, yeah, that's an oil tanker. The next day, a Japanese came over and bombed it. And we could feel the concussion on the land. And I tell you, I've seen so much that it just, I don't tell my kids, and I hate to talk about it, but I want to get this out. Mindoro, we went on the island, made the invasion, but about 4 or 5 days before, we had a submarine was going over, and the submarine came up and was looking, and he seen a flashlight. It was a Navy guy and 2 Army guys. They were prisoners of war on this island, and they flashed. The Navy guy had a flashlight, lucky, and flashed it to the submarine, and they flashed back, says, could you swim? And they said, yes, we can. So they said, come on out and we'll meet you. So they got a rowboat and went in there and got them 3 guys, and they came back onto Mindoro, and they told our sergeant and stuff what had happened. So they told us, be careful, because there was about 45 to 50 American soldiers and sailors on this one island that were captured. So we went on that island, and I guess it was, I don't know, 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. It was early, but they bombed it. Then we went in, and about 2 or 3 o'clock, it was in the afternoon, they says, where's them soldiers that were captured here? Where are they at? Oh, a Filipino came down and says, oh, they're over there in that building. So we went over and we looked in the building. There was nobody in there. So another Filipino came down and says, oh, they're over in that big foxhole over there. So we went over, and it was quite big foxhole. So we went over and looked, and then another Filipino says, you don't want to look in there. And we said, why? Well, because one of the two Japanese came over with blowtorches and burnt them. So we went over and looked, and there was smoke coming out. It was terrible. It was terrible. Yeah. Imagine 45 to 50 soldiers was over there. Sailors, between the 45 altogether. And I got pictures of it at home. And that was it, I could tell you. And that's why I'm going to cut it short. That's the most horrible things I've seen. And when they said we were ready, then we made on Panay, they said, now we're going to make the invasion of Japan. And that was about 3 or 4 months later. We were on this island, and we all said, boy, we'll never see life again, I don't think. And everybody says, I don't think so neither. The way we landed on those islands, and we were lucky that I'm 89 years old, and I'm lucky I'm still living. I keep saying that. And anyway, when they dropped that atomic bomb, we were all happy. We were all happy. We said, at least now we know we're going to live. And after that, we stayed there for another 3 more weeks, and then we went to Korea. We went to Korea and I was there for 6.5 months. I was corporal. They called me in and then they put me sergeant because my sergeant left and says, you know, you deserve sergeant stripes. So about 3 or 4 weeks later, they called me in and says, hey, you're ready to go home. They had the paper right here, and I was right here, and they were sitting right there. Says, sign this paper right here, and when you come, you go home for 3 months, and then you come back as a sergeant. And I says, I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not coming back. I said, I'm going to go home and stay home. So that's one of the stories. I could tell you a lot more, but that's enough. Thank you very much.
Well, that concludes our presentation. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, veterans. If you see a veteran out there, please thank them. And if you get a chance, please come up and say hello to the guys. Thank you very much.
You get a commission from the artist Harriot for selling pictures?
Good, but also a person that appreciates you for me.
Light.